it's hard to think of an organization or institution or movement that is more emblematic of digital culture today than Anonymous.
So you want to join Anonymous? You cannot join Anonymous. Anonymous is not an organization. It is not a club, a party, or even a movement. There is no charter, no manifest, no membership fees. All we are is people who travel a short distance together, much like commuters who meet in a bus or tram. For a brief period of time we have the same route, share a common goal, purpose or dislike. And on this journey together, we may well change the world. Nobody could say, you are in, or you are out. Do you still want to join Anonymous?
And so I wanted to talk a little bit about Anonymous. Actually, I'm not going to talk about Anonymous. I'm going to talk about what Anonymous represents. That's a little different than what Anonymous actually is. If you're interested in what Anonymous is, where it comes from, why people have become involved in it, the kinds of things they do, how it's organized, I would point you towards an ethnography by someone named Biela Coleman, who's done some great work on this. Others have as well. But that's looking at Anonymous itself. I want to look at kind of what it stands for. And right now it stands for some version of what a hacker is. That Anonymous kind of, when you use the word Anonymous, you think of a hacker. If you haven't seen the first season of Mr. Robot, you should go watch that. And someone went and talked to a bunch of people in Lulzec, which is this group that is kind of the organizational wing of Anonymous. And they actually were big fans of the way that Mr. Robot, not very subtly, suggested the kinds of actions that Anonymous took part in. So it represents that kind of view of the modern hacker. I want to talk a little bit about 3 ways in which it's worth looking at Anonymous as this kind of emblematic view of hacker culture. And that's the first one, is that kind of continuity, this end of this last version of what it means to be a hacker. And so the ideals of Anonymous are somehow attached to the ideals of hacking, and that's evolved over time. And so I want to talk a little bit about that. The second is, why is it that Anonymous is anonymous? How does anonymity kind of affect this? And the third is something we've talked a lot about, but this idea of collective behavior or crowdsourcing political action, and what kind of effect Anonymous has had on thinking about that. So first, hacker culture. What is hacker culture? What is the hacker ethic? What are the kind of hallmarks of what makes a hacker? Over time, the depiction, the view of what a hacker looks like has changed, right? The early view of the hacker was a long beard. I'm trying to get there, right? The wizard, the person who stayed up late and played with technology and was probably very introverted. I'm thinking about a character in Real Genius who kind of lived in a closet, lived in the tunnels under a thinly veiled Caltech. This kind of view of this person who was so into the technology that he may, and it was usually a he, may not have particularly strong social skills, probably not very cool, and I think from the 70s all the way through into the early 80s, this was the overwhelming view of kind of what it was to be a hacker. And then, there were things that were attached to it. The computers were definitely a big part of it, obviously, but also things like model trains. Some of the early hackers were very involved in the model train club at MIT, and some other pieces that were sort of definitely, of course, these are wizards, so the tie back to Dungeons and Dragons and to Zork and some of the games that were built up coming out of Dungeons and Dragons. So there were pieces of this that go back and were kind of part of the lore of being a hacker. That merged or morphed into, especially during the 80s and going into the 90s, the emergence of cyberpunk fiction, and that cyberpunk fiction in some ways inflected what it meant to be a hacker. Neo from The Matrix is probably the tail end of this. The beginning of cyberpunk literature of science fiction is either something like Neuromancer is probably the early big touchstone, or Mona Lisa Overdrive, but so there were characters there, but Neo is probably one of the big ones, and for those of you who've run into Spider Jerusalem from Transmetropolitan, that's probably also kind of an emblematic view of this. And it was an overlap with punk, and Tank Girl is not a hacker per se, but that ideal of punk, of making it work, of DIY, actually does overlap in interesting ways with the hacker movement. And it's why the maker movement is so close to hacking now. The maker movement is all about DIY. Punk was all about DIY too. Anyone could pick up a guitar and not really practice and start their own punk band. So the idea that you could make it yourself and have it work is pretty central to what the hacker ethic is. This kind of bricoleur, someone who takes stuff and puts it together into a bricolage, into something that works by patching things together, is kind of at the center of some part of the hacker ethic, which is kind of, let's just make this work. Throughout all of this, there is this kind of central contention, central set of hacker ethics, maybe, that shine through. So all of them are, to a certain degree, anti-rules, anti-authoritarian for sure, but also against rules that don't make sense. This idea that you should just follow the rules because they're the rules, but why? Right? It makes sense to follow rules that are rules that technology puts on you, or that help technology work better. But this technocratic view of who should have power, the ones who are best capable of using the tools and technologies, that's pretty central to the hacker ethic. They might not put it that way, but they tend to think that rules, the rationality around rulemaking, really kind of pushes you towards technological solutions. If there's a problem, you can solve it using technology. And that goes from the very beginning on, especially to today. A lot of the talk in Silicon Valley is, we can fix healthcare. We can fix education. There is a technological solution to every problem. And this very much ties into this idea of technological power. So hand in hand with that, if we lived in a technocracy, they wouldn't necessarily be anti-authoritarian, but because they feel like, many of them feel that the institutions, government institutions, large businesses, the current bureaucracy is irrational, is non-technologically literate, is unengineered. Because of that, they tend to take on this position of outsider and someone who wants to undo that from a number of perspectives. Many of them are fairly libertarian. This is kind of the Ayn Randian piece of Silicon Valley, folks who feel like their engineering prowess is restricted by unfair rules. And if you got rid of government, the engineers would just run things in kind of the Old West version of the country. And then you have folks who are much more traditionally social anarchists and feel that you could replace this better with collectives. And so this is kind of at the extreme left. It's weird, but these people generally get along. They might even call themselves anarchists on both sides. But it's because they share kind of a view that technology can help make things work better, either to make us work more collectively or to allow us the freedom to work on our own better. That runs all the way through. That's the cyberpunk piece. That's the old wizard that kind of he makes the computer center run. You can tell him to do something, but it's not going to matter because that's his kind of domain. If you've seen in the IT crowd this idea of going into a space that is not yours to go into, right? It belongs to the IT staff, and you have only a certain amount of ability to tell them what to do. So that goes from the very beginning days of hacking all the way through the cyberpunk version, definitely into the anonymous version. I don't know what the next iteration of it is, but it runs all the way through. This idea of breaking into things is also pretty central to what it is to be a hacker. The idea of hacking is to build something, but in order to build something, you have to take it apart. If you look at a lot of people who are trying to do makers movement stuff around education, a big part of that is getting people to take things apart. The Mozilla Foundation was really pushing on putting screwdrivers in kids' hands and letting them take consumer electronics apart. It's a lot harder with newer stuff, but taking your phone apart is actually kind of a pain because of a lot of reasons. But we'll leave that aside. If you look around my office right now, I'm not going to show it to you because it's a mess, but there's 2 or 3 large pieces of machinery that are no longer working, and rather than just put them at the curb, I'm taking them apart and letting my kids take them apart, because if you want to be a doctor, this is a bad way. You can't just pick up bodies and take them apart. This ends up putting you in prison. But if you want to be a technologist, this is a great way to learn how things worked. And no one had to encourage me to do that. When I was a kid, they had to hide screwdrivers so I wouldn't take apart the phone and any other piece of thing that had any other thing that had screws in it. So that's kind of a big piece of what it is to be a technologist. And frankly, places like MIT and Caltech have traditionally turned a blind eye to things like breaking into rooms that you're not allowed to be in, or the tunnels in both of those places are kind of the domain of students who very quickly learn how to get in there. And they've largely ignored that, or at least not prosecuted it heavily. Aaron Swartz is the great counterexample of this. One of the reasons people felt betrayed was that MIT generally would not go after someone like Aaron Swartz for doing what he did, even if though he broke the rules, and broke the user agreement, and theoretically at least broke the law. MIT generally wouldn't pursue things like that because it was part of the hacker culture to kind of test boundaries and take things apart and break into things that were secured, because that's how you understand how they work. In my first grad class each year, the grad students come in, and in one of those classes, I hand around locks and lockpicks, and they learn how to pick locks. Not because they're going to go out and steal stuff, I hope. Gosh, I hope. But because that idea of figuring out where the flaws are is an essential piece of becoming a good hacker and becoming a good technologist. And there's also this piece so Anonymous says they do what they do for the lulz. This actually comes out of 4chan and the Chans, and one of the reasons they have it is because it came out of that source. But that particular term, for the lulz, in other words, I don't need any reason to do this other than it amuses me. That runs through well before Anonymous. That goes into the cyberpunk. That goes into the old wizards too. The original term around this during the 1970s and 1980s was haha, only serious. So it's not just that I'm doing it. It's not just that I'm doing it for fun, but there's also this serious underlying component to it. And in some ways, I think Jon Stewart and The Daily Show really epitomized this, because they could be very incisive, very cutting in their humor, obviously, and go after structures of power, and then just say, wait, they had I thought was kind of a lame defense of it, which was, you're what? We're just a comedy show, right? But I think that idea of being able to kind of enjoy what you're doing it because it's fun. At least early on, this idea of pursuing things for money had the same kind of negative connotation that it had in playing music, right? You didn't want to be a sellout. You didn't want to work for Microsoft. You didn't want the man to kind of acquire your skills. And so why were you doing it then? Well, you were doing it because it's fun, because you're doing it for the lulz, even if you never would have used that term. So that runs through kind of the culture as well. I think you could draw out other threads of the hacker culture that Anonymous now represents, to the degree that it is still kind of in the public eye. But we'll stop with those three: this idea of kind of being anti-authoritarian, breaking into stuff, and doing stuff for the lulz. The other piece that drives Anonymous is, of course, the anonymity. And anonymity plays a really interesting cultural role online from the very beginning, because once you're online and can do things socially and nobody knows who you are, it gives you the ability to reinvent yourself. So you can be whatever you want to be online because nobody has any preconceived notions of what that is. Now, that's not entirely true. You're not ever really anonymous in these social spaces. Lots of people have done work about this, that your ability to spell matters online to a greater extent, and there are other cultural pieces, your understanding of certain ideas and memes and other things that you can't really escape. So just not having your real name being printed is not enough to fully be able to reinvent yourself, but largely you're able to reinvent yourself. And the question then is, if this is one of those great accidental experiments, which is, would you still do the right thing if nobody knew who you were? This is kind of like, if you had an invisibility cloak, would you suddenly become a jewel thief? Or would you do it to make everybody's day better? And I suspect that you'd have some of both, right? So, that's one of the really big questions that gets opened up, right? Would you are you going to be good when nobody knows what you're doing, when nobody can see you doing it? And so it is a very central ethical question. It's also a question around identity. So it used to be that you could go, often if you were high school in a small town, you could leave town, go to state college, and completely leave behind whatever identity you had built up during high school, whatever things that you no longer wanted to be associated with, you could kind of leave behind you and you could reinvent yourself. The internet allows you to do that on a continual basis. If I wanted to reinvent myself, I could just go out and create a new identity very easily. Or I could play multiple identities at the same time. I have other people out there under different names that are activated at times when I want to be those people, right? And those can be fairly elaborate, or they can just be on Reddit. Often people have alts. They have, throwaway accounts where they just want to make one comment with an ID, and so they do that, but they don't want to tie it back to their ID. And I've, again, strongly encouraged for those of you who are Redditors who use Reddit to do that in this course, to have basically a throwaway account that you can use for this course, so that your identity here does not get tied to your identity elsewhere. So it allows you to do that to a certain extent. That said, it also allows you to do bad stuff. Early on in the web, Georgia was one of the states that tried to pass a law that said you were not allowed to be anonymous online. A number of countries have done the same thing, saying that if you're going to be online, you have to be able to be tied to your real identity. Why Georgia? The reason for that may be obvious to you. If it's not, there's a long history of people in Georgia doing things in masks in public that are bad. So, if you ask someone, is there anything wrong with someone wearing a mask in public? There are a couple of things. To me, the first thing that comes to mind is, a bank robber, right? Robbery generally happens with your face covered so that the cameras can't record who you are. But certainly in the southern U.S., it was the Ku Klux Klan. They covered their faces so that they could behave with impunity in public spaces without ever affecting their everyday lives. And so it makes sense that Georgia would be one of the first states to try to do this unsuccessfully. And nobody has really in the U.S. tied it to that, because there's reasons. There's the other side of this, which anonymity allows you to say things in public that might be for the public good, but you're fearful that structures of power will stop you from saying them. So it's great for whistleblowing. It's great for taking action without the negative repercussions coming back on you. So, it's a two-edged sword for sure. This idea of trying to identify people. So part of the problem is that the part of the problem with anonymity is that it removes one of the central structures of social control, which is exile, right? There is the ban hammer. And I think it's hilarious that my young children understand what the ban hammer is, right? Because they've seen it in operation. They're on a Minecraft server that's meant for kids, and so it has a separate set of rules. And they've seen the ban hammer applied. They've seen people banned temporarily or permanently from that server. But the ability to ban people or to exclude them from a community only exists when you have a tie to a single identity, where you can't just go out and create a new identity and log back in, right? So particularly for people who are trying to find communities, they want people to feel like they're invested in the identity they have online. You're going to be less of a jerk if you've spent a lot of time building up your reputation as that person, is the idea. So a number of platforms, Google, Amazon, Facebook, have tried to implement policies that had you use your real name online. Putatively, Facebook still has this, although they've backed off it a lot. So there were all kinds of problems with kind of putting this real name behind your name. Amazon did it. There's still the tag that in reviews that says you're verified, and you're verified because your name on Amazon matches your name on your credit card. So that's one way to do it, right? But the idea behind this is you can trust people if they have a single identity in the way you can't trust people if they're anonymous. But that anonymity allows you to do things that you would otherwise not be able to do. And anonymous really identifies the most extreme version of that, because it can allow people to do things anonymously and do them in crowds. So this last piece is anonymous. Is Anonymous the greatest hacking group ever? No, it's not even the greatest sort of publicly known hacking group. Probably people are aware of a group called Cult of the Dead Cow, in part because Cult of the Dead Cow really tried to create a public image for themselves as a hacking group. They also produced a lot of software, a lot of scripts and other things that allowed people to hack into computers. So they really were a hacking group, but they tried to get media coverage for what they did, which is the opposite of what a lot of groups do, right? Anyway, in this space at least. But Anonymous is not so much famous for their ability to break into computers. They don't really do that. Their most famous stuff has been around shutting down computers by using a technique called denial of service. So denial of service is simply calling up a website or another computer, internet connected computer, so many times that it crashes because it can't keep up with the requests. This started actually as a kind of an outgrowth of the sit-in, right? If you send a whole bunch of people to a place and they all sit, you pretty much stop that place from working. So if you tell a whole bunch of people to hit the G7 site and keep hitting refresh, if enough people do that, you can shut it down. That approach where you have lots of people doing it is kind of called DDoSing, distributed denial of service, and so that's a lot of what Anonymous did. They also did it through kind of fake users, through botnets. So that allowed them to kind of stop things. But that's there is this hierarchy of hacking, right? Back in the day, which is, for me, because I'm old, really a long time ago, there was this idea of script kiddies. And script kiddies were people who just downloaded a toolkit and used that to break into computers. And that was considered really lame, right? Anyone could do that. Whereas if you had actual skill, you wrote your own scripts, or you found your own backdoors, or you did that sort of thing, right? So in that kind of hierarchy, Anonymous really falls into that script kiddie piece. So it wasn't really their technical approach that was celebrated, but their organizational one, which is they could throw a lot of human distributed resources at a problem. We can take a step back to a report that Rand produced several decades ago now, and it was in response to the Zapatista movement, which was this the EZLN, this peasant revolt out of Chiapas that managed to, originally the tools they were using were guns, right, AK-47s, but they very quickly kind of attached themselves to what was then the emerging internet, especially email lists, and used this to kind of grow their influence globally. And a couple of researchers at Rand saw that, and they said, this is coming, right? This idea of a network, what they called net war, is the future of warfare, is kind of, especially the future of sort of guerrilla warfare. So a small group could actually attack a state actor, not by using a gun, but by flooding the information space by using networks, especially networks without any central form of control. So you couldn't do a decapitation attack. In fact, it's the movement itself. The Zapatista movement was headed up by someone who was anonymous, Subcomandante Marcos, who was always in, there's pictures of him kind of across the world with him depicted with a mask on and a pipe. And just like the Dread Pirate Roberts, anybody could step up into that role because it is an anonymous role. So you couldn't, and because it was a network, if you decapitated it, because people shared ideals, they would just keep working, and you can't really take off the top. This combination of anonymity and adhocracy allowed Anonymous to take action that otherwise was very difficult. So, two of their most well-known targets, their most well-known target was probably attacking Scientology, but they also went after the Westboro Baptists. Both these groups were very resistant to traditional forms of public protest, to policing institutions doing anything. They managed to carve out a space by using the laws to their own advantage, and it was very difficult to resist them, in part because if you did so under your own name, they could turn that attack back on you. But the anonymity of Anonymous allowed them to kind of carry out attacks that were widely distributed, that drew on fairly wide human resources to reach an end. So that ability to move without a traditional institution is really what made Anonymous particularly strong. Now, it's not doing that much now. I think what's left is the ghost of Anonymous, this kind of emblematic view. Part of the problem with it is that it's really hard to make that transition into a more traditional organization, and it's hard to disavow. Anybody can put up an anonymous video or say that they're taking an anonymous action, and it's really hard to disavow that. But it did demonstrate the ways in which adhocracy and large-scale crowdsourcing of political action could work, particularly in combination with anonymity. So I think basically that Anonymous is a good entry point for asking questions rather than answering them. It provides kind of a way of thinking about potentials for politics that we wouldn't otherwise think about.